The wind clawed at the canyon walls like a wounded beast, its howls slicing through the icy air as Jace Colton blinked against the blinding glare of snow. Blood streaked his temple, freezing in the cold, while shards of wood and metal from the shattered wagon jutted from the frozen earth below. His legs lay useless beneath him, numb as the rocks buried beneath the frost, and his right arm dangled at an unnatural angle, a useless weight. Above, Nora Slade's voice cracked like thin ice. "Tommy won't wake up." Her words swallowed by the wind's relentless scream. Jace tried to call out, to reassure her, but his throat burned with the cold, his breath shallow and weak. The boy's stillness gnawed at him, a silence heavier than the snowdrifts piling around them. How had it come to this? 3 years ago, he'd ridden back in a sandstone with nothing but dust on his boots and a soul hardened by wanderlust. He'd left behind his father's ranch, his family, and the ghost of a man he'd once been, a man who believed in dreams of open skies and unbroken land. But the sandstone he returned to was a graveyard of those hopes. His sister Clara Vaughn's words still echoed in his skull that autumn night. "This is your home, but you've never been happy here." She'd been right. He'd spent a lifetime running from grief, from responsibility, from the weight of a name that felt too big for the hollow shell he'd become. Yet here, in the frozen wreckage of a wagon and a boy's breathless body, he'd finally stopped fleeing. The choice that brought him here wasn't a single moment, but a chain of them. The first time he'd seen Tommy shivering outside the station restaurant, defiance burning in his wide eyes. The Christmas Eve he'd wrapped boots and chaps for a child he barely knew. The day he'd asked Nora to marry him. Not for love, but to give Tommy a future. Now, as darkness crept at the edges of his vision, Jace wondered if the boy would live long enough to see that future, or if they'd both become another tragedy swallowed by the canyon's hunger. Jace Colton had spent years perfecting the art of detachment. He'd walked past hungry children in sandstone's frozen streets, ignored the hollow stares of men who'd lost everything to the railroad, and buried the ache of his own fractured family beneath layers of indifference. So when he first saw Tommy shivering outside the station restaurant that autumn night, he kept moving. The boy's defiance, "I'm waiting for Nora. She's my sister. I don't let her walk alone," should have meant nothing to him. But those words clawed at something dormant in Jace, a memory of his own childhood when his father's absence had left him guarding an empty house, waiting for someone who never returned. Days later, when Nora stormed into the restaurant, her fury sharp enough to cut the warmth of the hearth, Jace watched her berate Tommy for breaking Tessa Merrow's rules. The superintendent's threat hung like a noose over their heads, but Jace's voice cut through the tension like a blade. "He'll eat. We'll pay." Tessa's glare was a warning. Nora's eyes burned with resentment, and Tommy's untouched sandwich sat like a monument to their helplessness. Yet, as Jay sat beside the boy, the loneliness he'd fled for years seeped back in, thicker than the stew cooling on the table. Weeks passed, snow blanketed sandstone, and Christmas Eve arrived. Jace found himself at the shack, his arms laden with parcels for a child he barely knew. The door creaked open, and Tommy's face lit up, a spark of joy so raw it made Jace's chest tighten. "I thought you weren't coming anymore," Tommy whispered, his small hands trembling as he reached for the gifts. Jace masked his unease with a grin, but the truth gnawed at him. Why did this boy's hope matter so much? Why did the idea of Tommy leaving sandstone feel like a knife to his ribs? As the boy tore into the packages, boots, chaps, a hat too big for his head, Jace's mind raced. He'd spent a lifetime running from responsibility, from the weight of caring. But now, watching Tommy strut like a miniature ranch hand, laughter echoing in the cramped shack, Jace realized he'd already crossed a line he couldn't retreat from. The fire between him and Nora had sparked that night in the restaurant, but it was Tommy's laughter that had lit the fuse. And when Nora entered, groceries in hand, her anger softened for the first time. Jace knew he was no longer just a passerby in their lives. He was tangled in their story, whether he wanted to be or not. But why? That question haunted him as he handed Nora the last package, her fingers brushing his briefly before she pulled away. "He needs more than presents," he said quietly, the words slipping out before he could stop them. "He needs a place to belong." The silence that followed was heavier than the snow outside, and Jace wondered if he'd just doomed himself to a fate he wasn't ready for, or if, for the first time in his life, he'd found something worth staying for. Tommy's laughter bubbled like a spring brook as he tugged the tiny chaps over his threadbare trousers, the leather creaking with each exaggerated swagger. The hat, far too large for his small head, flopped comically over one eye, but he wore it like a badge of honor. A miniature cowboy in a world where he'd always been too small, too fragile, too burdened by the weight of his sister's sacrifices. "You look better than I do," Jace said, his voice light but strained, as if the words carried a weight he couldn't name. For a moment, the shack felt warm, alive, a fleeting illusion of home. The fire crackled in the stove, the scent of bread and wood smoke mingling in the cramped air, and Tommy's boots scuffed the floor with the rhythm of a boy who'd forgotten, for a heartbeat, the ache in his chest from the nights he'd fallen asleep to Nora's muffled sobs. But the illusion shattered when Nora pushed open the door, her arms laden with groceries, her cheeks flushed from the cold, and something else unspoken, a grief she tried to hide beneath brisk movements and clipped sentences. The fire in her eyes had dimmed since Christmas Eve. Now, it was replaced by a hollow resignation, a weariness that clung to her like the frost on her coat. She set the sacks on the table without a word, her hands lingering too long on a loaf of bread, as if grounding herself, as if the simple act of holding something solid might keep her from unraveling. Tommy, still strutting in his new attire, chirped. "Nora said we might be leaving soon." She was crying. The boy's tone was casual, but the words hit Jace like a gut punch. His chest tightened, the air in the shack suddenly too thick to breathe. He'd spent weeks avoiding the truth, but now it clawed at him. Tommy's laughter, the way the boy's face lit up when he called him partner, the quiet moments when Nora's guard slipped and her eyes softened in his direction. He hadn't come here for her. He'd told himself that again and again, a mantra to shield himself from the dangerous pull of her defiance, her resilience, the way she fought for Tommy even when she had nothing left to give. But as Tommy beamed up at him, cheeks rosy and boots scuffing the floor, Jace felt something fracture inside him, a desperate, aching need he couldn't ignore. Before he could second-guess himself, the offer spilled out, "Give him to me. Let me raise him. Marry me. Safety, not love." The words hung in the air, raw and unvarnished, like the winter wind that seeped through the cracks in the shack's walls. Nora froze, her back to him as she unpacked a jar of preserves, her fingers trembling against the glass. When she turned, her eyes burned with a fury he'd expected. But there was something else, too, a flicker of vulnerability she couldn't quite mask. "You want Tommy, not me," she accused, her voice low but sharp as broken glass. Jace's jaw clenched, the muscles in his neck taut as a rope pulled taut. He wanted to deny it, to soften the blow, but honesty had always been his curse. "I want a family," he said, the admission colder than the wind outside. The room seemed to shrink, the walls closing in as Tommy, sensing the shift, fell silent, his small hands gripping the edge of the table. The boy's laughter had evaporated, leaving only the creak of the stove and the faint hum of the wind. Nora's lips parted, then pressed into a thin line. When she spoke again, her voice was quieter, almost pleading. "You don't even know what love is," she whispered. Jace flinched, not because her words stung, but because they were true. He didn't know love, not the kind that healed, not the kind that stayed. He knew loss, abandonment, the hollow ache of promises broken. He knew the weight of a father's absence, the sting of a brother's disdain, The emptiness of a ranch that had once echoed with laughter but now stood silent. But he knew the way Tommy's laughter filled the silence in his bones, the way Nora's defiance made him want to be someone better, someone who could stand still long enough to be counted on. Still, she shook her head. I won't trade my brother for safety. Not to you. Not to anyone. The finality in her voice was a door slamming shut. Jay stepped back, his boots heavy on the wooden floor. He didn't argue. He didn't beg. But as he reached for the door, he caught a glimpse of her. Her hand pressed to her chest. Her gaze fixed on Tommy, who stood frozen in his oversized hat, eyes wide with confusion. The boy's joy had curdled into fear, his small shoulders hunched as if bracing for a storm he couldn't name. Jace left without looking back, the cold biting through his coat as he mounted his horse. He didn't see the tears Nora blinked away or the way she knelt to wrap Tommy in her arms, whispering promises she wasn't sure she could keep. He didn't know that later that night, she'd traced the edges of the chaps he'd gifted the boy, her fingers trembling as she wondered what might have been. He only knew the weight of rejection, the familiar sting of being left behind. But somewhere deep in her chest, Nora's heart was already bending toward him, slowly, painfully, like a willow in a storm. And though she'd never admit it, the idea of a life where Jace Colton stood at the center of it no longer felt like a cage. It felt like a choice she was afraid to want, a choice that terrified her, not because it was unsafe, but because it was everything she'd never dared to hope for. Spring arrived in Sandstone with a fury that cracked the ice and softened the earth. But for Jace Colton, the thaw felt more like a surrender, a slow, reluctant unclenching of fists he hadn't realized he'd been holding. The note had come at dawn, slipped beneath his cabin door with the scent of wood smoke clinging to the paper like a ghost of the hearth he'd never built. Come with me. Let me show you where your house could be. The handwriting was deliberate, unadorned, Nora's. He'd read it twice, fingers lingering on the edges as if the paper might burn. Every instinct screamed at him to stay away. He'd spent weeks nursing the ache of her rejection, convincing herself that Tommy's laughter and Nora's fire were ghosts he'd never lay claim to. But the pull was stronger than reason, stronger even than the scar where his father's ranch had once anchored him. By midday, he was in the saddle, the reins tight in his grip as he rode toward the shack that had become a symbol of everything he wanted and couldn't name. The wind carried the scent of damp soil and blooming sagebrush, but Jace barely noticed. His mind churned with questions he couldn't voice. What does she want from me? Why now? When he arrived, the door swung open before he could knock. Tommy stood there, grinning in the boots and chaps Jace had gifted him weeks ago, the oversized hat now slightly less absurd but still a badge of pride. The boy's face lit up like a lantern, but Jace's chest tightened. He's grown into them, he realized, the thought sharp as a splinter. Behind him, Nora waited, her expression unreadable. She wore a coat buttoned to her throat, its fabric worn but sturdy, her red hair pinned loosely under a scarf that fluttered in the breeze like a flag of uneasy truce. No greeting, no explanation, only a nod toward the wagon parked near the road. They worked in silence, loading supplies in a small trunk that Jace assumed held everything they owned. As they climbed aboard, the wagon creaked under their weight, its wheels groaning like old bones. Tommy perched between them, knees bouncing with anticipation, while Nora kept her gaze fixed ahead, her hands clenched in her lap. Her knuckles glowed, white against the wool of her gloves. Sandstone watched them go. At the edge of town, the railroad tracks cut through the mud like a scar, and there, standing in the shadow of the station, was Tessa Marrow. Her broad frame was rigid, her face a mask of disapproval, but her eyes followed them with something sharper than anger: calculation. Jace kept his posture stiff, refusing to acknowledge the woman who'd made life harder for Nora and Tommy than any blizzard ever could. The wagon jolted as they crossed the tracks, the rhythm of the wheels shifting from the clatter of stone to the squelch of thawing earth. For the first time, Jace felt the weight of what they were leaving behind. The town that had judged them, the job Nora had risked for Tommy's sake, the cold, familiar ache of solitude. And yet, what they were chasing felt just as fragile. A dream of wildflowers in spring, of a boy's laughter echoing in a home that didn't exist yet. The hills rose gently at first, then steepened into slopes dusted with wildflowers pushing through the frostbitten soil. Tommy's voice broke the quiet, high and eager. "Is that where your house will go?" He pointed to a ridge where two rivers converged, the land sloping gently toward the water. Jace's throat tightened. It was the spot he'd dreamed of since boyhood. The place where his father had once told him stories of building a home, with corral gates that faced the sunrise. "It's been my dream since I was your age," he admitted, the words raw with memory. Nora turned to look at him then, her eyes softening in a way that made his chest ache. "Any woman would be a fool to say no," she murmured, almost to herself, but the wind carried it to him. For a heartbeat, he dared to imagine it as an answer, not to his proposal, but to the question he hadn't asked yet. "Would you stay?" But the canyon loomed ahead, its jagged cliffs casting long shadows over the trail. The air grew colder, the sky darker, as if the mountains themselves resented their intrusion. Jace's hands tightened on the reins. He'd ridden these paths 100 times, but today, the terrain felt foreign, hostile. Tommy's laughter faded into silence, replaced by the steady crunch of hooves and the creak of wood. Nora's shoulders tensed, her gaze flickering to the wheel that wobbled slightly with each rut. They lingered too long at the ridge, drinking in the view, as if the beauty of the land could shield them from what came next. When they finally turned back, the sun had dipped behind the canyon, and the chill in the air carried a warning neither of them voiced. Jace handed the reins to Tommy, settling the boy between his knees to steady him, and let the horse pick its way down the trail. For a moment, it felt like they'd won, like the house on the hill, the laughter, the quiet promise of belonging were within reach. But the canyon's shadow clung to them, deeper than the dusk, heavier than the silence. And somewhere in the recesses of Jace's mind, a voice whispered, "This is too much hope for a man like you." Fate, it seemed, was already sharpening its knife. The wheels snapped with a sound like a gunshot, splitting the fragile calm of the canyon into shards of chaos. The wagon lurched violently, its frame groaning like an old man buckling under unbearable weight as the axle twisted sideways, splintering with a sickening crunch. Jace's shout, "Jump!" was ripped from his throat, swallowed by the deafening crash of splintering wood and the panicked whinny of the spooked horse. For a heartbeat, time fractured into fragments. Tommy's small body crumpled against Nora's chest, her fingers clawing at his coat as if sheer force of will could anchor them. The sky flipping sideways as the wagon tilted, the horizon spinning into a blur of snow and rock. Jace's useless arm flailing for leverage, his legs already betraying him, numb and unresponsive. Then came the fall, a blur of snow, rock, and bone-jarring impact that echoed through his spine like 1,000 hammers. Darkness took him like a thief, swift and merciless, swallowing his consciousness whole. When he woke, the world was a haze of pain and shadow, the edges of his vision blurred as if he were staring through frosted glass. Nora's face hovered above him, her cheeks streaked with tears frozen to her skin, their salt crusting her pale complexion. Her breath came in ragged puffs, visible in the frigid air, and her eyes, those fierce, unyielding eyes, were wide with terror. "Tommy's hurt. He won't wake," she whispered, her voice raw, splintered by panic. Jace tried to sit, to move toward her, but his body refused. His legs were dead weights, numb and unresponsive, his right arm dangling at an unnatural angle, the bone jutting sharply beneath his sleeve like a jagged blade. He forced his lungs to draw breath, the cold searing his throat like fire licking at his windpipe. Wrap him up. Build a fire. I'll be fine, he lied, the words brittle as the ice cracking under his back. He knew the truth. The cold would kill them both before dawn. Hypothermia would creep into their bones, slow and silent, stealing Tommy's breath while Jace lay helpless. But Tommy was still a boy's heartbeat away, and Jace couldn't let either of them go. Not now. Not after everything. He gestured weakly toward the wagon's wreckage, his voice a ragged rasp that barely pierced the wind. Blankets, matches, keep him warm. Nora hesitated, her eyes wide with terror, but his stare hardened, the old steel in his voice cutting through the fog of pain. Go, he commanded, and she obeyed, scrambling through the debris with trembling hands. Her fingers dug into the snow-covered remnants of the wagon, pulling free a moth-eaten blanket and a box of matches soaked through with ice. Jace watched her, every movement a dagger to his ribs, until she returned to Tommy's still form, wrapping the boy in layers of fabric and whispering promises Jace couldn't hear. The fire sparked to life with her third attempt, its weak flame flickering like a dying star. She huddled over Tommy, shielding him with her body, her shoulders shaking as the wind howled its mockery. Jace's vision blurred again, the darkness creeping at the edges, but he held onto the sound of her voice, soft, desperate, alive, until it faded into silence. Days later, Jace awoke to the sterile sting of antiseptic and the weight of finality pressing on his chest. The hospital room felt smaller than a coffin, its pale yellow walls closing in as his sister Clara loomed over his bed, her face carved from stone. Her lips moved, but the words were muffled, distant, until they slammed into him like a freight train. You'll never ride again. She spat the words, colder than the New Mexico winter, her judgment a blade that slipped between his ribs. But Jace barely felt it. His mind replayed the crash in endless loops, the tilt of the wagon, the way Tommy's head had lolled limply against Nora's shoulder, the sound of her voice as she begged him to stay conscious. Then the door burst open, and there she was, Nora, wild-eyed and breathless, her scarf askew, snow clinging to her coat like frost-kissed petals. Tommy needs a real doctor, she pleaded, her voice cracking. "'Cause not enough. I don't have money. I don't know where else to turn." Jace stared at the ceiling, the gears in his head grinding. His ranch, his father's land, the last tether to his past, flashed in his mind's eye. The house he'd dreamed of building on the ridge, the corral gates facing the sunrise, the wildflowers in spring. His brother Sam Cade had always wanted it, smirking at family dinners with thinly veiled contempt. The deal formed in Jace's throat before he could stop it, spilling out like blood from a wound. "Sell my half. Give the money to her. All of it. For Tommy." His sister Clara froze, her lips parting in disbelief, but Nora gasped, stepping forward, her hands trembling. "No, Jace," he cut her off with a glare, his voice thin but ironclad, a threadbare flag snapping in the wind. "Do it. It's the only thing left I can give that boy." He'd traded his pride, his birthright, for a child who shared none of his blood. The irony wasn't lost on him. The man who'd spent a lifetime running had finally stopped to shield someone else from the storm. But as Nora's tears fell onto his blanket, darkening the fabric like rain on dust, and his sister Clara turned away in disgust, Jace felt no regret. The cold had nearly taken them all, but this time he made sure Tommy survived, even if it meant burying the last piece of the man he used to be. The doctor's arrival was a shadow against the hospital's sterile light, his calm presence clashing with the storm raging inside Jace's chest. His coat was crisp, the scent of antiseptic clinging to its fabric, and his boots clicked methodically against the linoleum, a rhythm that grated against Jace's nerves. "You're here for Tommy?" Jace rasped, his voice still frayed from weeks of silence and pain. the words catching in his throat like splinters. The man's smile was gentle, almost amused, as if he were privy to a truth Jace had yet to grasp. "No," he replied, setting his bag on the bedside table with a soft thud. The leather creaked as he opened it, revealing instruments that glinted under the harsh overhead lights. Nora insisted. "She said you wouldn't accept help unless you thought it was for someone else." The words hit Jace like a physical blow, knocking the air from his lungs. His mind reeled, scrambling to piece together the fragments of deception he'd missed. The ranch, his father's land, the last tether to his pride, had been sold not for Tommy's future, but for a man who'd spent his life believing he didn't deserve one. His fingers curled into the stiff hospital sheets, knuckles whitening as memories surged. Nora's trembling hands on the wagon's reins, the weight of her gaze as she'd watched him limp into the shack on Christmas Eve, the way she'd never once asked for anything, not even the chaps or boots he'd gifted Tommy. She'd bargained with his brother Sam Cade, a man who'd always resented him, her voice steady as she signed papers for a stranger's land. Had she flinched when Sam sneered? Had her breath hitched as she handed over the deed, knowing Jace would hate her for it? Or had she done it with quiet resolve, her heart a clenched fist around the truth she couldn't voice aloud? The doctor's voice cut deeper, steady, and unrelenting. She didn't ask for help for herself. She's here because of what she feels. The sentence hung in the air, heavy as the silence that followed. Jace stared at the ceiling, its pale yellow surface blurring as his throat tightened. For years, he'd defined himself by his solitude, by the belief that love was a myth told to fools. But now, the hollow ache he'd carried, the one that even morphine couldn't dull, felt different. Not empty, but full, as if Nora's actions had poured something into the void he hadn't known could be filled. He imagined her kneeling beside Tommy's cot in the dead of night, smoothing the boy's hair as he slept off the effects of his minor injuries, her tears falling onto his forehead like benedictions. He saw her haggling with a railroad surgeon, her voice sharp with desperation, her hands gripping the edge of the man's desk until her knuckles turned white. She hadn't come for Tommy. She'd come for him, a man who'd offered her safety but never warmth, a man who'd thought sacrifice was the same as love. When Nora arrived that evening, she moved like a ghost, soft, deliberate, her red hair dimmed by the hospital's harsh glow. The door creaked as she entered, the sound swallowed by the tick of the clock above his bed. "You're better now," she said, her voice careful, distant. "Tommy's safe. We don't need you anymore." The lie was obvious, but Jace let it pass, his heart pounding as he gripped the edge of the bed. Every muscle screamed as he forced himself upright, his legs trembling beneath him like saplings in a storm. The room spun, the walls tilting like a carnival ride gone wrong, but he didn't fall. Instead, he staggered forward, 3 agonizing steps closing the distance between them. The cane clattered to the floor, forgotten. His right arm hung useless, but his left found her shoulder, anchoring him. When his lips met hers, the world narrowed to the warmth of her breath, the steady beat of her pulse against his chest. It was a kiss raw with desperation and gratitude, his stubble scraping her chin, his hands tangling in her hair as if he could pull her into his bones. It wasn't just the kiss that shook him, it was the truth of it. Nora hadn't left when he'd offered her safety. She hadn't taken his money and vanished into the night. She'd stayed, fought, loved him in the only way he'd understand, by giving everything, asking for nothing. And as he collapsed into her arms, his legs trembling from exertion and emotion, Jace realized he'd never felt stronger. Not because he'd walked, but because he'd finally let someone carry him. Her hands pressed to his back, holding him up, and he'd buried his face in her neck, inhaling the faint scent of lavender soap and sweat. "I didn't know love until now," he gasped, his voice breaking against her skin. It was a confession, a surrender, a plea all at once. The room faded. The doctor's watchful gaze, the hum of fluorescent lights, the distant clatter of a nurse's cart. There was only Nora, her heartbeat syncing with his, and the quiet revelation that love wasn't a grand gesture. It was this, a man who'd spent his life running, finally standing still enough to be seen. The wedding unfolded on a sunlit rise cradled between two creeks, where spring had unleashed its full fury. Wildflowers blanketed the hillsides in chaotic splendor, bursts of violet aster and goldenrod trembling in the breeze like scattered jewels. The air hummed with the earthy perfume of damp soil and budding sagebrush, a scent that clung to the fabric of Jace's borrowed coat as he stood waiting, his cane digging slightly into the grassy slope. A dozen ranchers formed a loose semicircle around the altar, a flat rock draped with a homespun cloth stitched by Nora's own hands, its uneven stitches a testament to her stubborn independence. The elderly preacher, his face weathered like old leather, adjusted his spectacles with a fumbling patience, his voice low but resonant as he murmured to himself, rehearsing the vows like a man entrusted with a sacred task. At the heart of it all was Tommy, clutching the ring box so tightly his knuckles glowed white. His tiny chaps, scuffed at the knees from countless tumbles, creaked as he shifted nervously, his boots tapping a staccato rhythm against the ground. The boy's eyes darted between Jace and the path Nora would take, his breath hitching when he first spotted her. A flicker of movement at the edge of the hill, a flash of ivory in the sunlight. Jace leaned on his cane, its polished wood smooth beneath his grip, a relic of his hospital days that now felt less like a crutch and more like a scepter of survival. The coat hung loose on his frame, the sleeves swallowing his wrists, but the weight of it anchored him. He lost muscle in the hospital, yes, but gained something sturdier. Purpose. And there she was, walking toward him, her dress a study in simplicity. Ivory muslin catching the light like the first snow of winter, its hem dusted with pollen from the wildflowers she'd brushed past. Her red hair cascaded freely, catching the sun like fire caught in a breeze. But it was her eyes that rooted him, steady and unflinching. They held a peace he'd never seen before, as though the storm that once raged inside her had settled into calm waters. When she reached him, the preacher cleared his throat, and Jace's voice cracked on the first syllable of his vow, the words raw with the weight of every lie, every sacrifice, every silent prayer they'd shared. "I promise," he rasped, the syllables thick as honey, "to let you lead sometimes." Nora's reply was softer, but no less fierce, her hand finding his with a confidence that made his chest ache, a grip calloused from years of labor, now offering itself as both surrender and strength. "You sure about this?" Jace asked, his thumb brushing hers as the preacher paused, the gesture tentative yet intimate, a question within a question. Her smile bloomed slowly, radiant and tinged with the ghost of their shared history. The Christmas Eve gift-giving, the canyon crash, the hospital bed where he'd first walked for her. "I always was," she murmured, her voice a threadbare whisper that carried across the hill like a vow. "You just had to catch up." The preacher's voice boomed then, final and resolute, and Jace's cane clattered to the ground as he pulled her into a kiss, a desperate, grateful collision of lips that tasted like forgiveness and beginnings. For a heartbeat, the world narrowed to the warmth of her breath, the steady drum of her pulse against his chest, the salt of her tears mingling with his own. Then Tommy's voice shattered the silence, a whoop so exuberant it sent a covey of quail scattering from the sagebrush. The valley echoed with it, the sound ricocheting off the hills until it seemed the land itself was celebrating. The ranchers chuckled, their laughter rough as gravel, while the preacher nodded, his smile streaked with tears that glistened like dew. Nora laughed against Jace's mouth, her fingers tangling in his hair, her joy uncontainable. But the true triumph wasn't in the vows or the ring, it was in Tommy. As the boys sprinted across the hill, arms flailing like a windmill. His laughter rang out, untethered and wild. It was the sound of a child who'd been spared the weight of fear, who no longer had to guard his sister's path or shiver alone outside a station restaurant. His joy was a testament to everything they'd fought for. A home stitched together not by blood, but by choice, resilience, and the kind of love that didn't demand perfection. Jace watched him, his vision blurring with tears, and for the first time in his life, he understood what it meant to belong. The wind carried Tommy's laughter into the canyon, scattering it like seeds into fertile soil, and Jace knew this was the future he'd dreamed of, the one he'd nearly died for. And it was worth every scar. As the sun dipped lower, painting the sky in hues of amber and rose, the guests lingered, reluctant to break the spell. One rancher plucked a harmonica from his pocket, its first notes tentative, then swelling into a melody that felt as old as the hills. Tommy returned, breathless and grinning, clutching a bouquet of wildflowers he'd torn from the earth with both hands. "For you," he declared, thrusting them at Nora, "stems askew." She knelt to accept them, her dress pooling around her like a river, and kissed his forehead, a gesture so tender it made Jace's throat tighten. Around them, the land seemed to sigh, the creeks murmuring secrets to the stones, the wildflowers bowing in the breeze. This was no grand affair, no opulent celebration. It was a beginning, raw and imperfect, rooted in the soil of second chances. And as Jace wrapped an arm around Nora's waist, feeling the solid warmth of her body against his, he realized the truth. Love wasn't a lightning strike or a fairy tale. It was grit, carved from sacrifice, resilience, forged in laughter and loss, and a boy's joy echoing through a canyon that had once swallowed their silence. Jace Colton had once proposed without love, not out of cruelty, but necessity. He'd laid his offer bare. Safety, stability, a future for Tommy, the boy who'd become a tether to something greater than himself. But now, as he stood on the rise between two rivers, the sun warming the earth beneath his feet, he understood the truth he'd spent a lifetime evading. Love wasn't a lightning strike or a fairy tale. It was grit carved from sacrifice, resilience, forged in the quiet moments when no one was watching. The house on the hill would rise, its frame shaped by his hands and hers, its windows catching the first light of dawn. Wildflowers would bloom in spring, their roots pushing through the cracked soil just as hope had pushed through the cracks in his armor. Tommy's nightmares, the ones that had haunted him since the crash, since the silence of a wagon overturned in the snow, had faded into nothing but dreams of chaps too big and hats worn like crowns. The boy laughed now without shadows, his joy a melody that softened even the harshest edges of Jace's past. Nora's fire had not dimmed, but had changed. It no longer burned hot with defiance alone. It glowed now with a steady warmth, a light that guided rather than scorched. She still argued with him over the placement of the barn, still challenged his stubbornness when he insisted on rebuilding the corral alone, but her voice carried a tenderness that once would have unnerved him. At night, as they sat by the fire in the unfinished house, her head resting against his shoulder, Jace would trace the scars on his arm, the ones the accident left behind, and wonder how he'd ever thought solitude made him strong. The ghosts of his father's ranch still whispered in the wind, the memories of abandonment and regret lingering like echoes in a canyon. But here, in the quiet of their shared silence, in the weight of her hand in his, he found his reckoning. He'd traded the land he'd fought to keep for a life he'd never dared to dream of, a life where love was not a grand gesture, but a choice made daily, fiercely and imperfectly. When Tommy sprinted across the hills, his laughter scattering like seeds in a breeze, it was not just the sound of a child at play. It was the sound of survival, of a family stitched together by wounds and willpower. Jace watched him, his chest aching with something he could finally name: belonging. The New Mexico sky stretched endless above them, the same sky that had watched him ride alone for years, now bearing witness to a man who had stopped running. He leaned into Nora's shoulder, his voice low. "I never knew it could be like this," he murmured. She smiled, her fingers tightening around his. "You're here," she said simply. "That's all that matters." And in that moment, the past lost its grip. The house would rise, the wildflowers would bloom, and Jace Colton would stand rooted. Not because he'd conquered his ghosts, but because he'd let someone walk beside him through the storm. Love, he realized, was not the absence of fear. It was the decision to build something enduring, brick by brick, laugh by laugh, under a sky that had finally stopped feeling too vast to hold him.